The UN met yesterday with specific intention of addressing global drug policy. It's the first time that they met specifically to talk about drugs on a global scale in almost 20 years. The tension mainly was over the death penalty being used for drug-related offences, and the battle was over whether to emphasise criminalization and punishment or health and human rights. Now, the outcome document, which is adopted by the member states, it didn't have criticism of the death penalty in itself, but it did say that countries should ensure that punishments are proportionate with the crime. Well, obviously what they mean by this when they're talking about disproportional penalties, this was what Mexican President Enrique Pena Nieto said. They're talking about the fact that in many countries in the world, 30 countries to be exact, the death penalty is used for crimes related to drugs. And they're saying that obviously this is disproportionate because obviously deaths were not directly involved in many of these crimes. Now, the Mexican president, not only did he call for a review of this, he also has called for the decriminalization of marijuana for medical and for scientific purposes. And he has gone on to say that in the next few days, Mexico is going to make a huge overhaul. It's going to announce specific drug policies that have an emphasis on health and human rights. So this is big news for Mexico. First of all, if we just talk about the fact that they are likely to decriminalize marijuana for medical and scientific reasons, it's obviously following on from the United States, from the changes that have been made over here. And there has been talk about this for a number of years now. So it does seem that the move is inevitable. But obviously Mexico being such a huge producer of marijuana, this is obviously a big change and a big step forward in terms of the legalization of marijuana on a global scale.
It absolutely is. And the fact that Mexico is catching up in terms of looking at drug use, in terms of how Western countries do it, where it's more of it's treated like an illness instead of a crime. Unfortunately, there was one study done by the harm reduction, harm reduction group, HRI, and The Economist cited them, and they looked at countries where the penalty for drug smuggling or drug use, it was overwhelming. They cited 25 countries. They're namely in the East, or in the Middle East rather, China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Pakistan, places like this, where you can actually be put to death for drug use, or if you're considered to be a smuggler, if you have a certain amount. It's unfortunate because the drug situation, it's a relentlessly globalized business, and unfortunately there's such a massive disparity between how the West looks at it and how the East looks at it. You sometimes see these standoffs in cases.
Sure. Well, 685 people were executed. This is approximate, obviously, but as far as we know, as far as the United Nations knows, 685 people were executed last year alone for drug-related crimes. Indonesia alone executed 14 people. Now, the problem as well with this is that many of the drug criminals are actually non-violent criminals. It actually always ends up usually being typically ethnic minorities, and also resulting in the imprisonment of millions and millions of people. Now, just ahead of this week's meeting, a number of people, including Bernie Sanders, including Hillary Clinton, including the current UN Secretary, there was a letter written to the current UN Secretary calling for the fact that the war on drugs has failed, and saying that we should be now emphasizing not so much on repressing the use of drugs, resulting obviously in the imprisonment of millions and millions of people, and in some countries obviously the death penalty, but the emphasis should now be on health and human rights and on treatment. Well, the Global Commission on Drug Policy, this is a group that includes the former UN Secretary Kofi Annan, it includes Richard Branson, it also includes the President of Mexico. They formed a group called the Global Commission on Drug Policy, and just last month alone, they've been arguing this point. They've been arguing on alternative approaches to be used, including the abolishment of capital punishment, the abolishment of the death penalty for drug-related crimes.
I mean, that's a very noble cause, but at the same time, it would be difficult to have even member states of the United Nations who look at drug use very differently than the West does, namely in the Middle East. They see the death penalty as an appropriate punishment for that quote-unquote crime. They don't see it as an illness as we would in the West.
China, Saudi Arabia, as you mentioned, Iran as well, they were very inflexible at this meeting. It did seem that the majority of the countries at the UN, they were for this progressive movement, but China in particular, Iran, Saudi Arabia, they were inflexible. They showed little flexibility on the approach on changing their rules on the death penalty being used for drug-related crimes. And it's interesting, especially when you think think of Saudi Arabia obviously being an ally to America, the fact that we have such different policies over something like this, and the fact that despite them being our allies, they do seem very inflexible when it comes to change. Interestingly enough, the last time that a meeting at the UN was put forward specifically to address global drug policy, it was way back in 1998, and the meeting ended with basically a target of actually ridding the world of drugs in entirety, illegal drugs, excuse me, ridding the world of its illegal drugs by 2008. Now, obviously, this was completely unattainable. So here we are, almost 20 years later, and the UN meets again for this global drug policy meeting. Now, they can't quite come to an agreement, but it does seem like progress was made, and it does seem like the majority of countries involved at the meeting do want to change the way we look at the death penalty in particular, not necessarily forcing countries around the world to abolish the death penalty, but certainly to try to encourage them to not use the death penalty for drug-related crimes and to reduce the imprisonment of millions of people for non-violent criminal offences related to drugs.